Arthur Kipps arrived in Crythin Gifford with a chill in the air and a deeper chill in his heart. The village seemed to welcome him with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The journey from London had been long, the countryside growing increasingly desolate. As the train chugged along, the bustling cityscape gave way to vast, empty fields and twisted, leafless trees. The further he travelled, the more isolated he felt, as if he was leaving the world he knew far behind. The village itself was shrouded in a perpetual mist, a dampness that seeped into his bones. The cobblestone streets were slick with moisture, and the buildings, old and weathered, seemed to lean inwards as if whispering secrets to one another. Every step Arthur took echoed in the empty streets, amplifying the sense of abandonment. Even the midday sun seemed unable to penetrate the oppressive gloom that hung over the place. The weak rays of light struggled to break through the thick clouds, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the village. It was as if the sun itself was reluctant to touch Crythin Gifford, leaving it in a state of perpetual twilight.
The villagers, too, added to the unsettling atmosphere. Their faces were etched with lines of worry and fear, and they moved with a cautious, almost furtive air. It was clear that something weighed heavily on their minds, something they were unwilling or unable to speak about openly. Their faces were hard, their eyes wary. Each glance they cast in Arthur's direction was filled with suspicion and a hint of fear. It was as if they were expecting something terrible to happen at any moment, and his presence was an unwelcome reminder of that dread. They spoke little, and their words when they came were clipped and suspicious. Conversations were brief and filled with pauses, as if they were carefully choosing their words to avoid revealing too much. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and Arthur could feel the weight of their collective unease pressing down on him. I tried to engage them in conversation, to inquire about Eel Marsh House, but they only offered me tight smiles and quickly turned away. It was clear that the mere mention of the place brought discomfort, and no one was willing to discuss it. The more I pressed, the more they retreated, leaving me with a sense of foreboding and a growing curiosity about the secrets that Crythin Gifford was so desperate to keep hidden.
He found lodging at their local inn, a dark and dusty place that smelled of damp wood and stale beer. The innkeeper, a woman with a face like a dried apple, eyed him with open distrust. When he mentioned Eel Marsh House, a flicker of fear crossed her features.
"Best not to speak of that place," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper.
Despite their reticence, Arthur gleaned fragments of information from the hushed whispers that followed him wherever he went. The house, he learned, was cursed. A woman in black had been seen there, a spectral figure said to bring misfortune and death. The villagers avoided the place, especially after dark. The following morning, Arthur set out for Eel Marsh House. The only way to reach it was across the Nine Lives Causeway, a narrow strip of land that connected the mainland to the island where the house stood. The tide was out, the causeway exposed, but the air was thick with fog, reducing visibility to a few feet.
As I made my way along the causeway, a sense of unease settled over me. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my own footsteps and the cries of unseen birds. The fog swirled around me, cold and damp, obscuring everything beyond a few paces. I felt utterly alone, cut off from the world.
Eel Marsh House loomed out of the mist, a tall, gaunt structure that seemed to suck the light from the day. Its windows were dark, lifeless eyes staring out at the desolate landscape. The garden was overgrown and neglected, the air thick with the smell of decay.
Arthur approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He tried the door. It was unlocked. He hesitated for a moment, listening, but there was no sound from within. The silence was absolute, unnerving. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside.
The interior of the house was dark and dusty, the air thick with an almost tangible sense of neglect and abandonment. The air was heavy with the smell of damp and decay, a musty odor that seemed to cling to everything. Cobwebs hung from every corner, their delicate threads glistening faintly in the dim light. The furniture was draped in white sheets as if the house itself was trying to hide its secrets. This gave the rooms a spectral appearance, like ghosts, frozen in time. Arthur wandered from room to room, his curiosity mingled with a growing sense of unease. His footsteps echoed on the bare floorboards, each step amplifying the silence that surrounded him. He felt a constant prickling at the back of his neck, an unsettling sensation that made him shiver. There was a sense of being watched, an invisible presence that seemed to follow his every move.
Several times he thought he saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, like a fleeting ghost. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there, just the empty corners of the room staring back at him. He heard noises too, faint creaks and groans from deep within the house, as if the very walls were whispering secrets. But he dismissed them as the sounds of an old building settling, trying to convince himself that there was nothing to fear. Yet, the feeling of unease never left him, a constant reminder that he was not alone in this decaying house. Shadows seemed to dance in the corners of his eyes, always just out of sight, leaving him to wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him. As he moved through the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past was watching him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Arthur stood by a window, staring out into the night, wondering what secrets this old house held, and if he was ready to uncover them.
As night fell, a storm rolled in, bringing with it an air of foreboding that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows and sending shivers down Arthur's spine. The old house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, reacting to the storm's fury. Rain lashed against the glass and the sea roared angrily in the distance. The waves crashed against the shoreline with a relentless force, echoing the turmoil inside Arthur's mind. Arthur sat huddled by the fire, trying to ignore the sounds of the storm and the growing sense of unease that gnawed at him. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more ominous.
Suddenly, a sound cut through the howling wind, a sound that sent a chill down Arthur's spine. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm, but unmistakable. It was a child's cry, high-pitched and mournful, coming from somewhere upstairs. The sound was haunting, filled with a sorrow that seemed to pierce through the storm's rage. Arthur froze, his blood turning to ice. He had heard stories about the house, tales of restless spirits and unexplained phenomena, but he had never believed them, until now. He listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. The cry came again, louder this time, as if the child were moving closer, seeking help or perhaps something more sinister. The cry came again, closer this time, filled with an unspeakable sadness. Arthur knew he had to investigate, despite the fear that gripped him. He couldn't ignore the cry for help, even if it meant facing whatever haunted the house.
The cry came again, closer this time, filled with an unspeakable sadness. Arthur took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He rose from his spot by the fire and made his way towards the staircase, each step heavy with dread.
Mustering his courage, Arthur grabbed a candlestick and crept towards the stairs. As he reached the top, the crying stopped abruptly. An unnatural silence descended upon the house. He moved slowly down the hallway, his shadow dancing eerily on the wall ahead of him.
He reached the room where he thought he had heard the cry. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open cautiously and peered inside. The room was empty, the furniture shrouded in white sheets, but as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something in the window. A face, pale, gaunt, with eyes as black as night. And then it was gone.
Arthur Kipps shivered, his breath visible in the frigid air. The chill seemed to penetrate his very bones, making him feel as though he would never be warm again. The cold seeped through his heavy coat, no matter how tightly he wrapped it around himself. He rubbed his hands together, trying to generate some warmth, but it was futile. Eel Marsh House loomed before him, stark against the grey sky. Its towering structure seemed to defy the very elements, standing tall and foreboding amidst the fog. Mist curled around its base like ghostly fingers reaching out to ensnare anyone who dared approach. The fog rolled over the grounds, adding to the eerie atmosphere. He walked towards the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step seemed louder than the last, the gravel crunching beneath his feet like a warning. The iron gate creaked open, a mournful sound that sent shivers down his spine. It was as if the gate itself was lamenting his arrival. He stepped onto the overgrown path, each step heavier than the last. Weeds and brambles tugged at his legs, as if trying to hold him back. The air grew colder as he approached the house, a chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. His breath came out in visible puffs, a stark contrast to the dark, looming structure. The windows, like empty eyes, stared back at him. They seemed to follow his every move, watching, waiting. Arthur fumbled with the rusted doorknob, his fingers numb from the cold. It felt like an eternity before it finally gave way. It turned with a grating sound, the noise echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness within. He pushed the door open, stepping into darkness. The air inside was even colder, if that was possible, and carried a sense of foreboding. The smell hit him first, damp, musty, like a forgotten tomb. It was a scent of decay and neglect, of years without life. He took a breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in on him, making it hard to breathe. The air was thick with silence, a silence that pressed down on him, suffocating him. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting for him to make a move. Arthur fumbled for a light switch. Click. Nothing. He pulled out his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Dust motes danced in the air, swirling like tiny ghosts. The house felt heavy, oppressive. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He moved further into the house, each step echoing on the bare floorboards. He ran his hand along a wall, feeling the rough texture of peeling wallpaper. A sense of unease settled over him, a feeling that he was not alone. He stopped, listening. Was that a whisper he heard? A sigh? He shook his head, attributing it to the wind whistling through the gaps in the windows. Arthur found a dusty armchair and sat down, shining his flashlight around the room. His eyes fell upon a small framed photograph lying face down on a side table. He picked it up, brushing the dust away. A woman stared back at him, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes, dark and haunted, seemed to follow his every move. He turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faded ink was a name, Janet Humphrey. He felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard whispers in the village, stories about a woman who had lived and died in this house, a woman who had lost her child. They said her grief had driven her mad. Arthur placed the photo back on the table, a strange feeling of sadness washing over him. The photograph, worn and faded, seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories, each one more sorrowful than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the photo were watching him, pleading for something he couldn't quite understand. He had come to Eel Marsh House to sort through the papers of the deceased owner, but now he felt like an intruder. The house, with its creaking floors and whispering walls, seemed to resent his presence. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper of warning. He imagined Janet Humphrey wandering the halls, her heart broken, her spirit unable to find peace. The tragic tale of her life played out in his mind, a never-ending loop of sorrow and despair. He could almost hear her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, a constant reminder of her eternal suffering. He learned from the villagers that Janet had blamed her sister and her husband for her son's death, claiming they had refused to allow her to cross the causeway to the mainland, where her son was being cared for. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with fear and pity as they recounted the tale of Janet's heartbreak and her subsequent descent into madness. She died, consumed by grief and rage, cursing the family and vowing revenge. Her death was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new chapter of horror. Her spirit, fueled by an unquenchable thirst for vengeance, lingered on, haunting the house and the marshes, a dark shadow over the land. She became a spectre, a terrifying figure in black, forever bound to the house and the marshes. Her presence was a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen her, a ghostly figure that struck fear into the hearts of all who saw her. The marshes, once a place of natural beauty, had become a landscape of terror, shrouded in fog and haunted by the woman in black. As the day wore on, Arthur experienced a series of unsettling events. Doors slammed shut without a breeze, footsteps echoed in the hallway, yet no one was there. He began to doubt his sanity. Was it the wind playing tricks on him? Or was there something else at play? He tried to convince himself it was just the old house settling, but deep down a seed of fear had been planted. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched, that he was not alone. The whispers seemed to grow louder, the shadows in the corners of his vision more pronounced. Nightfall descended, shrouding the house in darkness. Arthur lit a fire in the old fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. He sat in a creaking armchair, trying to focus on his work, but the silence was unnerving. Suddenly, he heard it, a slow, rhythmic creaking coming from the next room. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The creaking grew louder, accompanied by a soft thudding sound. He slowly got up, his hand trembling as he reached for his flashlight. He peered into the darkened room. The rocking chair in the corner was moving, swaying back and forth as if pushed by an unseen hand. Arthur stood rooted to the spot, his blood running cold. The air around him felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was alive and breathing down his neck. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the rocking chair. It was as if an invisible force held him captive, compelling him to watch. It continued to rock, the creaking growing louder, more insistent. Each creak seemed to echo in his mind, amplifying his fear. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, he heard it, the distinct sound of a child crying. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. His breath caught in his throat. He strained to listen, hoping it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. The crying grew louder, filled with an unbearable sadness and longing. It was a sound that tugged at his heartstrings, making him feel an inexplicable sorrow. It echoed through the empty house, piercing his very soul. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, amplifying the child's anguish. Then, as quickly as it had started, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the haunting cries. A moment of silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. Arthur could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in the stillness. Then a blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness. It was a scream filled with terror and pain, sending chills down his spine. Arthur jumped back, his heart threatening to burst out of his chest. The scream seemed to reverberate through his entire being. He fumbled for the doorknob, his mind screaming at him to run, to escape. Every instinct in his body urged him to flee from the house and never look back. Arthur Kipps felt a chill creep up his spine, a sensation that seemed to seep into his very soul, a dread settling deep within his bones, as if the very air around him was thick with foreboding. He had come to Crithen Gifford seeking answers, hoping to uncover the truth behind the mysterious events, seeking closure on a tragic past that had haunted him for years. Instead, he found himself ensnared in a web of fear, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, a chilling narrative whispered on the wind, carried through the desolate streets and empty fields. The villagers, their faces etched with sorrow, spoke of a curse, a tale passed down through generations, a vengeful spirit haunting the marshes, a presence that could not be ignored. The woman in black, they called her, a figure shrouded in mystery and sorrow. Each whispered tale chipped away at Arthur's resolve, eroding his confidence bit by bit. He had been a man of logic, of reason, a man who believed in facts and evidence, yet here in this isolated village logic seemed to dissolve like mist, leaving only fear and uncertainty. The villagers recounted the woman in black's appearances. each sighting more terrifying than the last, always a harbinger of tragedy, a prelude to inevitable sorrow, always followed by the death of a child, a loss that left the village in a perpetual mourning. Their fear was palpable, a suffocating presence that clung to the damp air, making it hard to breathe. Arthur initially dismissed their stories as superstition, the ramblings of a community steeped in folklore and old wives' tales. But doubt gnawed at him, a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. He had seen her, the woman in black, her presence undeniable and haunting, her sorrow a palpable presence in the dilapidated halls of Eel Marsh House, a sorrow that seemed to echo his own. The lines between reality and the supernatural blurred, leaving Arthur questioning everything he once believed. Crythin Gifford was a village shrouded in sadness, its beauty marred by an undercurrent of despair. The villagers, weathered and worn, moved like ghosts themselves, their lives irrevocably intertwined with the legend of the woman in black. Their faces, etched with worry and resignation, spoke volumes of the toll the curse had taken. Fear was a tangible presence, a suffocating blanket that stifled laughter and joy. Children, their eyes wide with unspoken terror, were kept close, their playfulness muted by the ever-present threat. Arthur witnessed the impact of the curse firsthand. He saw the way mothers clutched their children a little tighter, their eyes darting nervously towards the marshes. He heard the fear in their voices as they recounted the latest tragedy, the latest young life claimed by the vengeful spirit. Even the landscape seemed to reflect the village's sorrow. The marshes, shrouded in mist and silence, held an eerie beauty that masked a palpable sense of dread. Desperation clawed at Arthur, fueling a reckless courage within him. He had come to Crythin Gifford seeking answers, seeking a semblance of peace for himself and the family he had lost. Now he found himself facing a different kind of loss, a chilling premonition that mirrored his own grief. He delved deeper into the tragic tale of Janet Humphrey, the woman in black. He learned of her pain, her isolation, the injustice she had suffered. He felt a pang of empathy for this woman, a woman driven to madness by grief and despair. A desperate plan began to form in his mind. He would find Janet Humphrey's child, the child unjustly taken from her and hidden away in the marshes. He would return the child to its mother's grave, hoping against hope that this act of compassion might appease her restless spirit. Triumph shattered, a mother's wrath unbound. The air crackled with an unnatural energy as Arthur carefully lifted the child's coffin, his hands trembling slightly under the weight of the small yet heavy burden. He could feel the weight of centuries of sorrow pressing down on him, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. Each step he took seemed to echo with the cries of the past, a haunting reminder of the grief that had plagued this place for so long. He carried the tiny coffin to Janet Humphrey's grave, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. The closer he got, the more he felt the presence of the woman in black, her eyes burning into his soul. As he lowered the child into its final resting place, a sense of peace washed over him, a fleeting moment of tranquility in the midst of chaos. He hoped this act would bring an end to the torment that had gripped the village. The wind seemed to sigh, the mournful cries from the marsh fading into an almost peaceful silence. It was as if the very land was holding its breath, waiting to see if the curse had truly been lifted. Could it be this easy? Had he appeased the woman in black with this simple act of compassion? Doubt gnawed at him, but he clung to the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he had done enough. Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered in his heart. It was a small flame, easily extinguished, but it was there, giving him the strength to believe in a better future. He returned to the village, a sense of relief washing over him like a cleansing wave. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. The villagers, their faces etched with cautious optimism, greeted him with gratitude. They had been living in fear for so long, and now they dared to hope for a brighter tomorrow. For the first time since his arrival, laughter echoed through the streets, tinged with disbelief but genuine nonetheless. It was a sound that had been absent for far too long, a sign that perhaps the curse was finally breaking. Arthur allowed himself a small smile. daring to believe that the curse had finally been lifted. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for now, there was hope, and that was enough. Vengeance unveiled, the woman in black's reign. In the dead of night, when the village was cloaked in an unsettling silence, her presence was felt more than ever. The woman in black emerged from the shadows, her sorrow replaced by a triumphant malice that chilled Arthur to his core. Her figure, once a mere whisper in the dark, now stood as a formidable force, a harbinger of doom. Her eyes, once filled with a haunting sadness, now burned with an icy fire, her lips curved into a cruel parody of a smile. It was a smile that spoke of untold horrors, of a vengeance that knew no bounds. She had been denied her vengeance, her wrath deflected, but her thirst for retribution was far from quenched. The graveyard, her domain, echoed with her unfulfilled desires, each tombstone a testament to her undying rage. She had taken the child not as an act of revenge against Arthur, but as a final devastating display of her power. It was a cruel reminder that she held the ultimate control, that no one was beyond her reach. She had shown him the futility of his efforts, the utter hopelessness of defying her will. Arthur, once filled with a glimmer of hope, now stood defeated, his spirit crushed under the weight of her malevolence. The curse, it was clear, was not so easily broken. It lingered in the air, a palpable force that ensnared the village in an unending nightmare. Grief, once a source of her torment, had become her weapon, wielded with chilling precision. She had mastered her pain, transforming it into a tool of terror that she used to exact her revenge. Arthur watched in horror as she vanished back into the mist, the child's limp hand still clasped in hers. The sight was a haunting reminder of his failure, a vision that would forever haunt his dreams. The villagers, their faces etched with a despair more profound than ever before, seemed to crumble before his eyes. Their hope, once a fragile light, was now extinguished, leaving them in a state of perpetual fear. Hope, so recently rekindled, was extinguished in an instant, leaving behind only a cold, hollow emptiness. The village, once a place of life and laughter, was now a desolate wasteland, a testament to the woman in black's reign of terror. Echoes of despair, the unending cycle of sorrow. In the aftermath of the tragedy, a heavy silence descended upon Crythin Gifford. It was a silence born not of peace, but of resignation, of the crushing weight of knowing that the woman in black's reign of terror would continue unabated. Arthur, forever scarred by the events he had witnessed, left the village, but the echoes of its despair followed him, whispering of the curse's unending reach. He carried the burden of guilt and sorrow, haunted by the faces of the villagers and the chilling image of the woman in black's triumphant smile. He had sought to defy fate, to break the cycle of pain, but in doing so, he had only tightened the woman in black's grip on Crythin Gifford. The woman in black remained a spectre, forever bound to the marshes, her sorrow an unquenchable thirst, her vengeance an unending cycle. A lingering question: can we escape our ghosts? The Woman in Black's story is a chilling exploration of the enduring power of grief and the devastating consequences of vengeance. It forces us to confront the darkness that can reside in the human heart, the potential for sorrow to twist and warp into something monstrous. But it also begs the question, can we ever truly escape our ghosts? Can we outrun the pain of the past? Or are we destined to be forever haunted by the echoes of our mistakes and the spectres of our grief? The Woman in Black, forever tethered to her sorrow, serves as a chilling reminder that true peace may lie not in seeking vengeance, but in finding a way to forgive, to let go, and to break free from the chains of the past.